Hello, my name is Jerry Gregg. I'm an independent Emmy Award winning producer based in Dublin, and I've been asked to talk to you about The Egg of a Seabird, a film we've been trying to make for about 20 years.
And my name is Mairead Nínuan. I worked for many years for the national broadcaster in Ireland, RTE, and I'm Jerry's partner on this project.
The Egg of a Seabird. What's it about? Well, first of all, let me set the context. It's a noble, exhilarating and unlikely true story. It will inspire and uplift audiences everywhere. While the backdrop to the narrative is tragic, the finale of the drama is transcendent. The action takes place mainly on the most rugged spot in Europe. Here, men and women fight an unrelenting war against the ferocious Atlantic Ocean in order to survive. They have little choice. Like their mothers and fathers before them, the islanders are compelled both to resist and to harness nature. In a landscape without trees or rivers, they must contrive to draw water, dig turf, weave cloth, and cast their nets all year round. They have no choice. They must soldier on or starve.
Somehow, they still make time to dance, play music and tell stories. Stories that have been handed down for generations. Stories that are the last faint echoes of a vibrant Gaelic repertoire of myths and sagas. By the early 1920s, the islands off West Kerry are inhabited by a small community of people who have only the most tangential contact with the events that have changed utterly Ireland and the world beyond in the wake of the Great War. Soon this secluded outpost of Gaelic Ireland will be subsumed by the pull of modernity and the irresistible appeal of factory work and weekly wages on the streets of Springfield, Massachusetts. But before the sun goes down on this unique way of life, the islanders send a message to the wider world. A message that endures as the last eloquent testimony from a vanished pre-industrial society.
Now, no less an authority than the distinguished novelist E.M. Forster is astonished by the content of the message and its lasting relevance to all who strive for meaning in their lives, no matter what the circumstance or the setting. It is Forster who describes this testament as the egg of a seabird, lovely, perfect, and laid this very morning. This film is the story of how this lovely, fresh egg of a seabird was miraculously created by the most unlikely artistic collaboration.
Our story features at its beating heart the extraordinary relationship between a young idealistic English intellectual and a peasant fisherman from the tough, remote Gaelic-speaking world of the Great Blasket Island, the most westerly point of the continent of Europe. Together, these two young men from two very different social planets create a work of literature that will endure and inspire all those who seek to understand and appreciate the magic and wonder of different cultures and different experiences.
So who are our major characters, the principals in this story? George Thompson is a brilliant young classicist from King's College, Cambridge. He arrives in Kerry in the summer of 1923. Ireland is in turmoil. A fratricidal civil war has just ended. A bitter general election campaign is underway. Thompson, suspected of being a British spy, is taken into police custody in Dingle in County Kerry for his own safety. However, his mission is not one of espionage, but education. A member of the Gaelic League at London, George has come to Ireland to pursue his lifelong interest in the Irish language. His destination is the Great Blasket Island, and from the moment he sets his eyes on the island, he falls in love. His affections are not just for the place, but for the people.
After immersing himself in the culture and folklore of the island, George falls in love with a local girl, Laois Ní Chearna. He also forms an unbreakable bond with a young Blasket fisherman, Muirish O'Sullivan. Thompson spurns the glittering prizes on offer to him, the brightest and most brilliant Cambridge classics scholar of his day. He decides to stay in Ireland with plans to teach. Sensationally, he secures the new government-funded post of lecturer in Greek through Irish at University College Galway. At the same time, he encourages Muirish O'Sullivan to write. On The Great Blasket, Thompson had spotted Muirish's talent as an imaginative and lively storyteller. George also dissuades Muirish from emigrating to America with his girlfriend Mairead Buckley and steers him to join the newly formed unarmed police force, the Civic Guards, An Garda Síochána.
By the late 1920s, both men are based in Galway, restless and full of energy and ideas. At University College Galway, Thompson has set out to bring the classics in Irish to the people of the Gaeltacht, the Irish-speaking districts along the west coast of Ireland. George also has romantic intentions. He hopes to convince his sweetheart Laois to marry him. But cultural prejudice and religious taboos conspire to frustrate his efforts and doom his love affair. Fiche Bliain Ag Fás, 20 years of growing, takes shape and comes to life during long dark winter's nights at Indrowan Garda Station in Connemara. It is both a lively homage to an idyllic youth on the Great Blasket Island and a moving memoir of a dying Gaelic way of life.
When Thompson meets strenuous official resistance to the earthy tones of Muirish's manuscript, he refuses to censor the authentic as opposed to the accepted depiction of island life. The authorities in Dublin declined to publish O'Sullivan's profane passages, the project founders. Years of work seem wasted as the Catholic Philistines now in power decree what is acceptable in print in Irish should accord with what is pious and spiritually praiseworthy. Now it's Muirish's turn to mentor George. He advises his friend to go home, where his insights and creativity will be appreciated. It seems as if their joint enterprise might never see the light of day.
George takes Muirish's advice. He abandons Ireland and takes the unpublished work back to England. There he renews his friendship with another King's College fellow, the acclaimed novelist E.M. Forster. Forster reads the translated manuscript and, impressed, promises to help. Connections are made. The prestigious publishers, Chato and Windus in London, are won over. E.M. Forster himself pens the introduction.
And Muirish, in his Garda uniform, travels to London for the launch of 20 Years of Growing. There's a buzz around town about the publication. At a swanky literary launch, the author of Passage to India takes to the podium, and he reminds the audience that Muirish has some unfinished business. And here he says, the author's main care is for the Irish original because it will be read on the Great Blasket. They will appreciate it more than we can, for whom the wit and poetry must be veiled. On the other hand, we are their superiors in astonishment. They cannot possibly be as much surprised as we are.
The book becomes a bestseller. Over 75,000 hardback copies are sold in England and Ireland in 1933-34. Muirish returns to Connemara and resigns from the Gardaí. He becomes the first full-time writer living and working in the Gaeltacht. And before George takes up his new life in England, he joins Muirish on one last journey to the Blaskets. The island has changed. The young have gone. The last of the islanders greet them like movie stars. George has helped finance an Irish language translation from his own pocket. And despite the hostility of official Ireland, the words in the Irish language edition are printed as Muirish wrote them.
On a late autumn evening, in his grandfather Dado Owen's candle-lit cottage, Murish keeps a promise he committed himself to when he first picked up his pen to write. He reads from his book, Fihe Blianig Fós. It is a defiant evocation of an era and a way of life that's about to be quenched. The last of the islanders are awestruck. Murish picks up his fiddle. George dances his last jig.
We will never see their like again.
Ní bheidh a lehéid a rís an.
50 years since he first set eyes on the Blaskets, Thompson came back to Kerry for the last time to reflect on what was and what might have been. As a young man, he had been struck by the humanity of the islanders. As an old man, he wondered whether the virtues that enriched life on the island would disappear along with the people, to the detriment of us all.
An gaiaddul síos, tá an seanna héile mí. Sa Blascaid agus an sógama, tá sean daoine fós an, ach ní fad éile war siad. Agus tá na daoine agus cultúr éile go, agus ní deirim ná gur céimchin gúil é sin, céim gúil, ní an éachar. Ach is fear go mór an bheatha tá níos ag na daoine óna nó mar bhíag na sean daoine an san istigh. Ach in san am híana tá rad ag an cailte, agus tar éir mar hiigim sé an scéil, sé an obair atá le díanamh inis ná agus bhí an smaoineamh cíanna a gom hana sa gáilíomh, sé sin le rá i dteachas nó aimsire a thuirt do bhaintear Chonamara ach in an deanga féin. Sé an smaoineamh cíanna a bhí gom le maris nuair a chuir sé go blá clí. Go dúrthainn sé isteach go dtí an saoil nó aimsire saoil na gatharacha móra, ach gan a chultúir féin a chailúint.
Tuigh dó go bhíad bhí mór epic insint I meagán focail I teanga iargúlta don mór phobal a bharach go deo, stáiln gur bine an sort duine bhí am. Stacar lom léamh go parsanta, Bhí flár nó gur lechas a baint leis, bhí úlaíocht a baint leis, bhí smachtaige léin agus gúlaigh sé héananig a láthair winsin I lán gur a hanig sé gur bíad san do lechra seachas leisin.
Is féidir a rá gur raibh tepe agam, gur raibh tepe orm in san obair a chud san rúm, sé sin muintir na gailteacht a thuirt isteach go dtí sí bhíolteacht an leanniuh, ach a gultúr féin a thuirt leo agus gannaí chailúint. Agus is tóilíonn gur obair sin atá le díanamh fós. Tá an gailge féin na chailúint ach ní deirim ná gur féidir í hábháil. Ach mar an féidir an tíbhíolteach nó tréhéidir den tíbhíolteach san a hábháil comma cad éon mhaithe. Mar ní éon mhaithe deanga féin ach an méid atá istigínte, an stair agus na nósa, an ilíocht, an litríocht agus mar sin. Na tréthe maithe bhíons na héileánaigh sin, tá siad istigh an nádúr an duine. Agus má tá siad múcht an sós an súd sa dán aniuh, a bheofar a rístiad.
Ba bhór an tatharú I gceann gáibh bliana Fíor glasig fása na casáin ceall siúlóide. Cúgnú séad a hithe dúnta agus na daoine him amach na mín tíd. Páircin na go raibh clathacha beag clochan na dimpel, de bhí ar licithe lár anis. Na paistí mór a dearaga a bhí hiad in naí, a bhar na buachalí agus na cailíní a bheith rincar a gach iad a dánaigh, ní a bhar rian a bhíar. Bhí na sílte ar lasa ins na tithe, ar a gwas a bhaile. De bhóla sa steach, agus is a bhí maithir agus maithir chéana ina sí ar gáthebh na tinine. Maithir chéana agus an tean rúdaige mar bagnáthach.
In his last years, we became very close because he couldn't speak much, but I would play to him a lot and I would read to him a lot. We read through, I don't know how many books, because he couldn't read by that time, he was nearly blind. And every evening I would play to him. Schubert, Mozart, so on.
And I can remember in his declining years, it was, for him, he became a different person. When somebody Irish came in the room and had the Gaelic, then he would become, you could see in his face it became like he was when he was a young man. So when at the end of his life he lost the use of his eyesight and his voice, he went back to Irish because it meant something deep, deep inside him, which, as my mother was saying, was, I think, to do with his mother and all the passionate convictions that made him the person that he was.
Ach ar is táchtaí istáilm ná go de Spáin se istáilm sa cóhéachs Ileanda ina bhuilimid má chuirmid sa ruch seothe gur Ileán í éire gur Ileán eile í an ratan. Istáilm gur de Spáin se an caidrih bunathe ar an úlaíoch scoláirúil gur féidir bheith han idir an dá hir gur tháinig an sasnach óg seo a caidrih gus a gcumann le héiring. Agus gur ág sé séile an grá ar an gaidirh áirthaid sin. Agus a bhuaigh an caradas adring ar slí. Tá Spáin sé gur féidir le tír eile gur tír bhuaí, teachta gáir ar tír bheag gur tír bheagaí. Agus go háidir a gás na Gaeilge gur tuigh dá go bhéteach an sasnach áirthaid seo. Cuir le adeochant agus craobhnú na Gaeilge ar slí a bhí difriúil ar fad. Is a chun ceap a bhí an de ag bunathirí an stáid.
Hi, I'm Ronan Moore Farrell.
And I'm Max Watchmaker.
Back in September of 2018, we began working on our National History Day project. The theme was triumph and tragedy, and given my Irish roots, we thought that the Irish potato famine was a great choice.
We researched in depth about the Irish potato famine, conducting some of our own interviews and gathering numerous primary sources. We presented our project at the state and national fairs. At the national fair, we won the AOH Irish History Award.
Thank you and enjoy our film.
Everyone that can go to America is going this year, as there is no prospect of anything here but poverty and distress. There is no room in the churchyards to bury the dead, as they are dying so fast, the coffins on the surface of the earth, which has no more room for them. Following the Battle of Kinsale in 1601, Ireland was a conquered nation. Traditional Gaelic land was handed to the conquering British colonists, and millions of native Irish were left to a subsistence life of potato farming. Ireland's high population density, dependence on a single crop, and conquest by England left them vulnerable to the crop failure of 1845. Famine led to tragic despair and starvation in Ireland, but also spurred immigration to the United States, where many Irish triumphantly succeeded in a new world. The Penal Laws, enacted in the 1600s, denied the indigenous Irish of many rights, including land purchase, higher education, and freedom of religion. British landlords enriched themselves with large land holdings, charging high rents to tenant farmers and evicting those who could not pay.
As the population expanded, land holdings became increasingly smaller, so you had a whole segment of society that had no property of their own.
Grains did not grow well in many areas of Ireland, and land devoted to grazing could not sustain the expanding population.
So when the potato came to Ireland, it took off remarkably. It could grow in poor soil, it could grow in bogland, and it was the potato which was the magic multiplier of mankind.
Ireland's population flourished, growing from 3 million in 1780 to 8 million by 1840. However, nearly half lived at a subsistence level and were dependent upon the annual potato crop. The stage was set for calamity should the crop fail.
Across the Atlantic in 1843, a field of potatoes near the port of New York wilted. An unknown disease spread west in the U.S., then to Europe. First in Belgium, then across Europe, and arriving on the eastern coast of Ireland in the town of Wexford in late 1845. Irish farmers watched their wilting plants with dread. Though Americans grew potatoes, it only represented 8% of the U.S. food production. In Ireland, by contrast, half the Irish population had come to depend on it. Once a field was infected, only days separated the first appearance of blight from completely rotting of the plant.
And the tragedy of the famine is that that blight came at precisely the moment in Irish history when the population had peaked.
All around me are familiar faces, worn out places, worn out faces.
Turning from the potato to other crops unfortunately provided no good solution for Ireland, since only 2/7 of the population could be supported without the potato. The harsh truth of this statement was lived out each day in the poorer counties. We regret to state that on Tuesday last a worker named Bridget Thomas died of actual starvation. There are hundreds of poor creatures in the same locality who are similarly circumstanced.
From the British point of view, although Ireland was part of their state, they didn't really see Ireland as being equal to Britain. And therefore, when the famine came, they basically said, you know, Ireland is on its own here. And this was the tragedy for us as Irish people.
Following the Act of Union of 1800, Ireland no longer had their own parliament. The British Whig Party believed in a laissez-faire approach and put Charles Trevelyan in charge of relief efforts. Unfortunately, he had a distaste for the Irish and felt that the famine was a visitation by God to solve an overpopulation problem. The English set up workhouses where conditions and labor were designed to be as harsh as possible, consistent with humanity, in order to dissuade the poor from entering.
Close quarters and weakened health meant that typhus and cholera ravaged its inhabitants, as many or more died of disease than famine outright. Irish farmers were faced with two difficult choices: stay and face disease and starvation, or leave their home country. Of those who stayed, 1 million perished during the successive years of the crop failures. Double that number left Ireland. Passenger ships were unprepared for this mass exodus, and ships like the Dombrody, designed to ferry timber, were modified to carry people in their cargo holds. The conditions were tight, and disease killed 1 out of 5 passengers. So treacherous was transatlantic immigration, the famine ships were referred to as coffin ships. Though we are known as a nation of immigrants, America of the 1850s did not welcome the Irish warmly. They were denied jobs or only offered dangerous ones in the mines or on the railways. They were also discriminated against because of their Catholic religion and preyed upon by secret societies such as the Know-Nothings. Abraham Lincoln was among the many Americans disturbed at the rise of the nativist Know-Nothing movement, as he explained in an 1855 letter. As a nation, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. We now practically read it, all men are created equal except Negroes. When the Know-Nothings get control, it will read, all men are created equal except Negroes, foreigners, and Catholics.
The Know-Nothing movement weakened after the Civil War, and the Irish exercised their political rights, voting at a higher percentage than others. By 1884, Irish Americans filled the mayor's offices in both Boston and New York. They embraced civil service, becoming a dominant presence on police forces and in firehouses. 3/4 of the immigrants on the New York police force were Irish in the 1850s. Though poorly educated in their own country, Irish Americans embraced education. Irish American girls were expected by their family to further their education similar to boys. They also became educators in higher numbers, and in some cities, over half the elementary and middle school teachers were Irish immigrants. Not only did Irish Americans ascend as a whole, there were individual stories of tremendous success in business, the arts, and civil service. During the famine year of 1847, William Ford and his parents, who had been tenant farmers in County Cork, Ireland, were evicted from their land. They boarded a famine ship for the U.S.
His mother died during the voyage, but William's son, Henry Ford, went on to become a successful automobile entrepreneur. He revolutionized transportation through his application of assembly line production. Presently, Ford sells over 6 million vehicles a year and employs 202,000 workers.
Americans of Irish descent also enriched literature and the arts, including F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote The Great Gatsby. Georgia O'Keeffe is recognized as the mother of American modernism paintings, and Margaret Mitchell captivated readers with her Pulitzer Prize-winning novel Gone with the Wind, which portrayed slavery in the South. In entertainment, Irish Americans were talented actors and advanced the entire film industry. Walt Disney, whose father came to America in the 1800s, had a flair for sketching and music and founded the Walt Disney Company in 1923. It is now the world's largest independent media conglomerate. Irish American individuals have also had a tremendous impact in politics. John F. Kennedy's grandfather, Patrick, lived in the south of Ireland and did not see a future farming a small plot of land in the starving nation. In the Great Hunger of 1848, Patrick Kennedy left for Boston. His son became a successful local politician, and his grandson became the 35th President of the United States.
So it's quite a triumph that JFK was elected with one person, one vote as the President of the United States, considering his 8 great-grandparents before they left Ireland were not entitled to vote, were not entitled to an education.
Kennedy felt a deep sentiment of service to our country, and this was shared by his fellow Irishmen who participated in the U.S. Armed Forces in large numbers.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Irish Americans have been awarded 2,021 Presidential Medals of Honor. This is more than double the number of any other ethnic group.
There are 34 million Americans who identify themselves as Irish, which is 7 times larger than the population of Ireland itself. Initiated by crop failure and amplified by the political and social situation in Ireland at the time, the hardship and tragedy of the potato famine spurred Irish immigration to the U.S. These immigrants' industriousness, emphasis on education, and service to our country is a lasting story of success and triumph.